Do you love where you live? Do you live in a rural community where you can see stars, breathe clean air, and know the names of your neighbors? Is the people-to-tree ratio at least 1 to 10, still more trees than people? And have you ever been told that you can't live this way, that it all has to change, that there must be more buildings, more traffic, and more lights, that progress has to happen, and you have no say? In the last century or so, many people have been led to believe that they have no say, and that progress, as people call it, is inevitable. You know, progress, it sounds good, like you're getting somewhere. Usually, when people say progress, they mean more buildings and fewer trees. They mean that the meadows must be paved, the horizon blocked off, and the old trees at the heart of your community must be chopped down for progress. Have you seen this kind of progress happen? Did it feel like progress or loss? When I was 8, I lost the top of my mountain to a shopping mall. The shopping mall was new and modern and full of rich, shiny things. The mountain was old, very old, full of trees and fireflies and wildlife. Then one day it was flattened and paved over, gone. When I was growing up in the 1980s, the trees and the mountains and the old local shops and the people who knew the stories and the language were still there, but they were disappearing fast. Before I could quite understand them, they were gone. The new things, the shiny things, were called progress. They were modern and, we were told, better than what we had. I grew up in a rural community, knowing change in rural communities is inevitable because I saw it every day. And there was one thing I noticed about change. We didn't get to choose what changed. The people from the cities did. The people from the cities chopped the tops off the mountains and planted strips of malls that they owned, and they ran. And if you could get a job there, you called yourself lucky. But those malls killed the shops that local people ran. Before that, it was strip mines and factories chopping up our place, but the story was always the same. We didn't get to choose what changed. When the jobs moved offshore and mines ran out, we were left with the ruins of those things that had never been ours to start with. But somehow now this mess looked like our fault. So the people from the cities said we were poor and swooped in to change us again. The last time I went back home, the old mall is nearly in ruins. But the new malls stretch over 5 mountains. The horizon is now all malls. Who decided on this future? Change may be inevitable, but who gets to choose what kind of change? Who gets to tell other people what kind of progress they need and what they should want? Who gets to say what change happens? In the rural community where I grew up, it was always people from somewhere else. And that change, it was good for them, not for us. So I grew up wanting to know, can rural communities have a say in their own futures? So today, I want to talk about that question. Who gets to choose what kind of change? To answer that question, I started to study and travel and think about this idea of progress and who gets to define it. I thought about whose values drive it and whose values get squashed in the process. I traveled all over the world, and everywhere I went, I wanted to learn about rural communities. In research, we call this positionality. Whether I admitted it or not, I was going to study rural development precisely because of who I was, a girl from West Virginia. I went to Bolivia on a Fulbright scholarship, and I worked in rural communities in the high Andes Mountains. Bolivia's history of Spanish colonization meant that the cities had been calling the shots for rural communities for 500 years. There was no rural investment, no infrastructure, no lights, no school past 5th grade, and no running water. Yet the Bolivians taught me that even in these oppressed conditions where the countryside was systematically starved of resources, rural communities could still take charge of change. I watched. In Bolivia, people in rural communities spoke their own language and farmed their own land, but they had some strategies. Someone from the family always went to live in the city, so there was a place for the kids to finish school, all the way through high school, up through university. City family members received produce and cultural connections from the country family. Country family got city lodging and market access from city family. Rural communities worked out a way to access the resources they needed to make their rural communities sustainable. I remember up on a mountain in Maragua, one community leader was complaining to me one day. He said, Senora, my community, it needs progress, it needs jobs. The government needs to bring us a factory. But I was watching. A group of local women had a better idea. What did they do? They linked up with an organization in the city to sell their artistic hand weavings, and they created their own jobs. Weaving was culturally significant, highly skilled, made with local materials, and weavings could be sold at a premium price to collectors in the city. Hand weaving could also fit in around other household activities, cooking, looking after children. It could be picked up and put down, a perfect work-from-home job. And the women owned it. It was theirs. Even in situations of structural poverty much deeper than we ever had in West Virginia, rural communities in Bolivia still worked out how to weave together their skills and their assets to create the future they wanted. They had land, language, culture, community, access to education and income, and opportunities for creativity and art. When I moved to Australia over 20 years ago, I found rural communities that were even better at taking charge of change. These communities in a wealthy country had a wider range of assets available to them. But they also faced structural economic conditions that stripped population and jobs from rural places. When commodity prices dropped and government offices and private companies closed down in rural towns, it's true, some little towns just died. But other towns survived and thrived. I set out to find out how they did it. I saw town after town in Australia taking charge of change and creating what they needed so that people could keep living in the place they loved. For instance, in Yakandanda, up on top of a mountain in Victoria, I remember when the last store and glass station closed down. No shop, no gas, you're up on top of a mountain. This could have closed down the town. Did they go away? No, they did not. A local community group bought this business. They ran it as a community-owned enterprise, and they were able to provide all those services to the local community. Not only that, they used the profits from that community-owned business to create the Yakandanda Community Development Corporation. There were other stories too. In remote farming regions, global price pressures on traditional commodities such as wool and wheat threatened cash-strapped family farms. Yet, many of these family farms in Australia managed to stay afloat. How? By diversifying what they produced. From alpacas to grapevines, gourmet cheese, wasabi. Some of them even put freshwater lobsters in the farm dams and raised them for market. Farming families learned marketing. They mobilized social media. They opened new markets for their unique products. Often it was the women taking the lead as entrepreneurs. I saw many small towns making a name for themselves by creating and promoting unique local assets. I remember in Western Australia, a little town called Boyett Brook had an arboretum, and they used that as a local asset to draw visitors. There's the colonial buildings in Richmond, in Tasmania, the history of papermaking in Burnie. And many of these towns became known as unique destinations, great places to go and ultimately great places to live, because attracting those visitors created a base for growing local businesses from the ground up and growing a lifestyle that the locals loved. Communities in Australia also defended themselves against outside schemes to take over their place, like Oyen in Victoria saying no to a toxic waste dump on their doorstep, and rural Tasmania standing up against a hydroelectric dam that would have destroyed the wild Franklin River. Communities said no to big projects from other places like the Bell Bay Pulp Mill in Launceston, a big pulp mill turning our trees to pulp for paper overseas. They promised jobs, but they could not guarantee not to destroy the beautiful Tamar River. Communities said yes to sustainable and high-value businesses that played to local strengths and were locally owned. In Australia, I've been inspired at how very small places with only a few hundred people can be sustainable and beautiful places to live. These are the places that aren't victims of change. They are the places that take charge of change and create the futures they want. So how do rural communities take charge of change? My work in communities around the world suggests that there are 3 keys to successfully controlling the destiny of your town. 3. It's easy to remember. First, being entrepreneurial. Second, staying engaged. And third, knowing who you are and what you value. So I'll go through these. First, successful rural communities are entrepreneurial. Locals look around them and they recognize their assets and resources, what they have that other places don't. They recognize their culture, the skills of their people, their mountains, their rivers, everything that is unique about their place and their people. Then they mobilize these unique assets to add value and solve problems. Successful rural communities are entrepreneurial. Second, successful rural communities are engaged. They engage with each other across organizations and groups, and they welcome and actively engage visitors and new residents from other places. In this way, rural communities learn and network and become stronger. Successful rural communities also grow their global networks, their global engagement. They engage with universities. They work and learn from organizations of all kinds beyond their local area and overseas. Successful rural communities learn and network. They're engaged. Finally, and I think most importantly, successful rural communities know who they are and what they value. They don't let people swoop in and change them. When someone tries to tell them they have to change, when someone tries to push them to change, these rural communities push back. They don't let anyone else decide what they need. They don't change to be like other places. Successful rural communities understand what local people care about, and they understand what local people don't want to lose. And they choose a future that will give them what they value. So, 3 things: being entrepreneurial, staying engaged, and knowing who you are and what you value. Those are some of the common characteristics of successful rural communities around the world. But in the end, every community makes different choices because every community is different, every community is unique. So, Louisburg, Susquehanna Valley, do you love where you live? Have you ever seen it changing and felt like you didn't have a say? Is your place starting to look a bit like other places, too many lights, too few trees? What has your community already lost? What might you lose? Have you been told you have no choice? My research demonstrates you do have a choice. The evidence is out there. Rural communities do not have to be victims of change. Rural communities can take charge of change and create the futures they want. Will your community take charge of change? It's up to you.